Tonight at 10, sterling on the slide again as the markets consider the potential impact of Brexit. It was another punishing day for the pound on the financial markets, falling to its lowest sustained level since the 1980s.
The weakness in the pound is really a sign that investors don't have confidence in a post-Brexit UK economic outlook, that they think that Brexit is going to be very negative for the UK economy and that GDP could contract going forward.
But in the City of London, the weak pound had another effect, pushed the index of 100 leading companies to a record peak. We'll be looking at the latest signals from the markets and at the likely consequences of the weaker pound. Also tonight, Trump on the election trail, but his campaign's in greater disarray, and he's in effect ditched the Republican Party leadership. A special report on care homes in England, with many having to close because of financial pressures. Samsung stops all production of the Galaxy Note 7 following reports that the smartphones can catch fire. And some outstanding saves by Joe Hart keep England at the top of their World Cup qualifying group.
In the south, the commuters struggling to cope with yet another round of Southern Rail strikes. And we hear from the UKIP councillor who's defected to the Conservative Party.
Good evening. The value of sterling has continued to slide today as investors reacted to renewed concern about Britain losing full access to the European single market. The pound fell to $1.21. That is the lowest sustained trading level since the 1980s. It also weakened against the euro. But the weak pound has had another effect. It's pushed the index of leading shares to a record peak. Our economics editor Kamal Ahmed explains the forces at work and the likely consequences of a weaker pound.
The pound under pressure again. Nervous markets, uncertainty over the path to Brexit, worries about the performance of the UK economy. A panicky cocktail that led sterling to dip tonight towards $1.21. It's not seen sustained levels this low since the 1980s.
The weakness in the pound is really a sign that investors don't have confidence in a post-Brexit UK economic outlook, that they think that Brexit is going to be very negative for the UK economy and that GDP could contract going forward.
On referendum night, it was for the Governor of the Bank of England to steady nerves.
So some market and economic volatility can be expected as this process unfolds.
Amid all the uncertainty, one thing definitely happened. Sterling fell by 11%, a fundamental market judgment on the threats to the UK economy. It's certainly been a rocky ride for the pound. Here's the beginning of the month when the pound was at $1.30. But it began to fall after Theresa May's speech at Tory party conference appeared to many investors to suggest Britain would not only be leaving the European Union, but the EU single market as well, which many economists see as a poor option. And then on Friday, the flash crash down to $1.14 as automatic computer trading drove down the pound. Since then, what is striking is this high level of volatility. The markets still feel very uncertain. Today, the pound fell to $1.21, a drop of nearly a fifth since the referendum. Now, as we import a lot of food and fuel, that could mean higher prices.
We do think that inflation starts to pick up from here, and particularly next year. And if people's incomes aren't rising at the same rate, then that's hitting real income, and perhaps that will slow spending, which is absolutely key to the UK economy.
Also key to the UK economy, the performance of some of our biggest businesses. For them, good news. The stock market hit record highs as exports strengthened courtesy of the weak pound, and there was a bonus for international businesses. If you earn profits in the strong dollar, it's cashing in time.
It does look good, but it is not a vote of confidence in the UK economy, and that is because the FTSE 100 is mostly comprised of multinational companies that do their business abroad. And also, given the currency fall that we have seen since the referendum, the revenues of those companies, when you translate it into sterling, look very good, and that's why the FTSE is rising.
Good cheer for large businesses, and if you are in the tourism or luxury goods market, the low pound has meant trade is booming. But For consumers more worried about filling up at the petrol station or buying the weekly shop, Britain's uncertain path to Brexit could mean more gloom ahead.
Well, Kamal, once again, we're talking about conflicting signals here from the financial market. So what do they tell us about sentiment and what do they tell us about the state of the economy?
Well, Hugh, I think you're right. There are two sort of conflicting messages going on here. One is short term, I think that's the stock market, and one is a longer term issue about the performance of the UK economy. Michael Saunders, he's a member of the Monetary Policy Committee. That's the economic experts that set interest rates, part of the Bank of England. He gave some very interesting evidence today to the Treasury Select Committee, where he said a fall in the value of the pound is actually a stimulus for the economy because the pound was overvalued. And that is something that businesses and the stock markets are reacting to, that short-term stimulus. He also said that the value of the pound could fall further. And that's where we look at the issues around how will the UK economy look this time next year rather than this time next week. And there, the fall in the pound is really investors signalling they are concerned about the possibility of a slowdown next year because of the uncertainty around our exit from the European Union. Final point, what does this mean politically? I think it's that issue, inflation. If we do start seeing import inflation into the UK on food and fuel, that's when it starts becoming a political issue for Theresa May.
OK, Kamal, once again, thanks very much. Kamal Ahmed there, our economics editor. Let's move on to some of the day's other news then. Donald Trump's campaign for the White House has descended into greater disarray, and Hillary Clinton supporters are expressing growing confidence that she will be America's next president. During the day, Mr. Trump suggested that he'd cut his ties with the Republican Party leadership, and he engaged in a sustained attack on Paul Ryan. He's the most senior Republican in Congress. So for the latest, let's join our North America editor, John Sopel, in Washington.
Hugh, there are just 4 weeks to go until America goes to the polls, and today Donald Trump opened up a new front in his race for the White House. No, not attacking Hillary Clinton or the Democratic Party, but the Republican candidate went to war with the Republican Party. You always know when Donald Trump is in a rage. It's never just a single tweet, they come as a torrent. He took aim first at the most senior elected Republican in the country, the House Speaker Paul Ryan, calling him weak and ineffective. Senator John McCain, who's abandoned Trump, is described as foul-mouthed. And then he lambasts the Republican Party as a whole. Disloyal Republicans are far more difficult than crooked Hillary. They come at you from all sides. And then the Democrats have always proven to be far more loyal to each other than the Republicans. But most significantly, this. It's so nice that the shackles have been taken off me and I can now fight for America the way I want to. In other words, Donald Trump is in effect now running as an independent, the outsider taking on the entire political establishment. From the mountains to the prairies. That will be music to the ears of these protesters outside Republican headquarters, furious at the way their man is being treated.
They said that they recommitted to the Trump campaign today. But words are cheap, and actions speak a lot louder than words. They've made a lot of promises to the Trump campaign over the years. Dozens of Republican lawmakers have abandoned Donald Trump in the past few days because they think he can no longer win. But the grassroots remain loyal and might just vote Democrat in key Senate and House races to punish those who have been disloyal. That means that not only is the presidency at risk, given the latest polls, but potentially control of Congress too. The Republican Party's perfect storm. And Democrats are starting to feel a little more confident. Bill Clinton saying the American people had a clear choice.
The question is, do you want change that builds on all the good things that are happening and makes more good things happen? Or do you want to go back to trickle-down economics and divided politics?
So what will Trump unshackled look like? Maybe this new attack ad is a clue.
Hillary Clinton doesn't have the fortitude, strength, or stamina to lead in our world.
This campaign has been ugly. It seems set to get a lot nastier still. The risk for Donald Trump is that this may appeal to his base, but does it broaden out his support in the way that he absolutely needs to if he's going to win? Donald Trump made himself popular with uncompromising messages on trade, immigration and jobs. Will it help him to keep going with these personal feuds against the Clintons and now against the Republican Party itself.
John, thanks very much for the latest there in Washington. John Sopel, our North America editor. Now, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has warned that Russia's role in the Syrian conflict could well turn it into a pariah nation. Mr. Johnson, who was addressing an emergency debate in the Commons on the Syrian crisis, said that Russia was responsible for recent attacks on hospitals and aid convoys, and he urged people to demonstrate outside the Russian embassy in London. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale watched the debate.
Another little girl pulled from the rubble of eastern Aleppo. Another child left orphaned by a war that's devastated so many lives. As Russian warplanes resume their bombing of rebel-held districts, thousands of miles away in Westminster, MPs debated the crisis for the first time in months.
We have a choice. We can turn away from the misery and suffering of children and humanity in Aleppo. We can once again, on our watch, appease today's international lawbreaker, Russia, or we can be seen to take a lead.
The pictures we see make us want to close our eyes, to turn away from the horror. But we cannot unsee what we have seen, and we must not turn our backs on the greatest crime of our century.
Listening to that on the front bench for the first time in his new job was the Foreign Secretary. He said Russia should be investigated for war crimes. He called for fresh economic sanctions. And
I would certainly like to see demonstrations outside the Russian embassy.
that prompted a flurry of sarcasm from Russian diplomats on social media. But the Foreign Secretary was not holding back.
If Russia continues in its current path, then I believe that great country is in danger of becoming a pariah nation. And if President Putin's strategy is to restore the greatness and the glory of Russia, then I believe he risks seeing his ambition turn to ashes.
But MPs wanted more than just protest. Some demanded no-fly zones over Aleppo and elsewhere, but that would involve the West being prepared to destroy Russian and Syrian warplanes and air defences. Some said more aid should be dropped by plane, but these crates can land in the wrong place and often don't contain enough. And others called for yet more diplomacy, and if that failed again, more economic sanctions.
We do need to explore no-fly and no-bombing zones. We do need to look at the question of airdrops.
There is absolutely a role for sanctions to get Russia back to the table.
What people in Syria need is bread, not bombs.
With our E-3 Sentry AWACS reconnaissance aircraft, any war crimes by air forces will be logged.
So the mood of the House of Commons was clear. The West should do more to confront Russia and the Syrian government, potentially even with the use of military force. But the Foreign Secretary was much more cautious, warning that the consequences of no-fly zones would have to be thought through very, very carefully. As for Labour, their front bench was reluctant to blame Russia for war crimes or do anything that might fuel the conflict.
In a multi-layered, multifaceted civil war such as Syria, the last thing we need is more parties bombing.
None of this, though, will change the lives of those struggling to survive here in the ruins of East Aleppo. For their fate is being decided by debates in Moscow and Damascus, not London or Washington. James Landale, BBC News.
The regulator for social care in England has warned that the entire market for looking after elderly and disabled people could be at risk. Evidence gathered by the Care Quality Commission and seen by the BBC says care homes are closing at an increasing rate. The document examined the financial health of some larger care companies and raised questions about the number of firms no longer wanting to take on council contracts. Our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt has the story.
Open the door.
Betty Smith is in her 80s and needs help to remain in her own home safely. This is a supported flat, which means there are care staff on hand to help her.
It's more happiness somehow, I think, the happiness, and the people that come in and you meet them.
How are you? Knowing that the same well-trained staff will be there each day is important to Betty and many others who need care. The not-for-profit company that runs these flats used to be a major provider of home care to local councils, but it's pulled out of those contracts because it says it simply isn't paid enough to do the job properly.
We wanted to provide care that's with staff that are well trained, well equipped, and providing the right quality of service. Without the right funding, that becomes very, very difficult.
The regulator, the Care Quality Commission, monitors the finances of some of the larger care companies in England. In an analysis seen by the BBC, it says the handing back of council contracts demonstrates the fragility of the care market. With council budgets squeezed, it asks at what point will this adversely impact on the quality of service. And that's what worries Cheryl Ennis, who used to work as a home carer for another company.
Sometimes the care is rushed and the client is not properly looked after. They're not properly cared for, and it takes away their dignity.
The CQC analysis also says the pace of closures amongst the more than 16,000 care homes in England is increasing, and it highlights the ongoing struggle to find and keep the right staff. This home in Oxfordshire now just concentrates on residential care for people with fewer health needs, after deciding to stop providing nursing care.
The first challenge is the lack of nurses, how difficult they are to recruit, and that's internationally as well as domestically. And also the difference between what the local authorities pay and the real cost of care.
The charity that runs the home was having to fund the roughly £300 a week difference between what the council paid for each person and the actual cost. There's increasing evidence of the serious knock-on effect that the problems faced by adult social care are having elsewhere. So, for instance, since they made the decision to no longer offer nursing care here, it's meant that the NHS has had to provide more district nurses to come in to see residents.
What we do know is that if we continue to reduce funding available for the broad range of public services, that leads to increased demands on the National Health Service, demands that the NHS is not well equipped to meet.
Care is funded differently in each of the UK nations. In a statement, the Care Quality Commission says in England most adult care is good or outstanding. The government says more money is being put into the care of older and disabled people. Alison Holt, BBC News.
The Korean technology giant Samsung says it's permanently stopped production of its new Galaxy Note 7 smartphone because of concerns about safety. It's also told retailers to stop selling the device. Last month, the firm recalled 2.5 million phones following reports of them catching fire and batteries exploding. The same fault has now been reported in replacement phones. Our technology correspondent, Rory Catlin-Jones, has the latest.
It was the latest version of Samsung's giant smartphone, and it won rave reviews. But then this happened. In a fast food restaurant in South Korea, a phone is on fire, one of several incidents over the last 10 days. And these all involved replacement Note 7s, sent out after the first overheating issues emerged. Now Samsung has admitted defeat, halting production and sales of the phone. Customers have been told to turn them off and return them to stores. In London this morning, this man who bought previous versions of the Note was disappointed.
Well, I pre-ordered the Note 7 in mid-September, and I got it the day it came out. I was really excited, and I loved the phone, and I was told to send that back, so I got my replacement, and I was perfectly happy with it. I was really heartbroken to have to take my new phone in and hand it back.
Samsung broke new ground with the Note, proving there was an appetite for much bigger phones, and it hoped this latest version would be the best-selling yet. Now, though, it's clear that the Note 7 isn't coming back, and the company must concentrate on limiting the damage to its whole brand. Shares in the company fell sharply, wiping billions off its value, as investors worried that the reputation of its other products might suffer.
What's very interesting about Samsung is that it really is respected as being technologically excellent and also really great functionally. Now, when that very basis of trust has been damaged, that's what they need to recover from, and that will be the test on whether or not they're able to recover some of the value that they really are losing by the day.
While this incident is the most serious so far, Samsung isn't alone in seeing smartphone batteries overheat.
The reason for the problem is that modern smartphones are immensely powerful computers. They use an awful lot of energy to make all those wonderful things work. That energy could be dangerous if it gets released quickly, and in certain circumstances that can happen. That is just the problem.
We want more and more from our phones, but as Samsung has found to its cost, the one thing we demand above all others is that they are safe. Rory Catherine-Jones, BBC News.
The Prime Minister is expected to highlight the problem of modern slavery in a speech to be delivered tomorrow at Westminster Abbey, celebrating the work of the anti-slavery campaigner William Wilberforce. In the past, she's called it the greatest human rights issue of our time. It's thought at least 10,000 people have been trafficked to the UK and forced into prostitution or domestic slavery. Most of them come from a few countries, including Romania, where sex trafficking has become much more widespread. From there, our correspondent Naomi Grimley has sent this report.
Mihaela, who's 26, is a survivor of human trafficking. And here in a women's shelter in Bucharest, she's trying to rebuild her life. Looking on is her baby girl, fathered by her last trafficker. She was trafficked not once, not twice, but 3 times around Europe.
When crossing the border, I had a gun to my head and they told me to give them the ID and to smile. In the mornings and afternoons, I'd have 15 clients. Then in the evenings through to the next morning, they'd bring another 20.
In the end, it was a client racked with guilt who helped her to escape. Many of the victims of trafficking come from remote villages. Nicorest in eastern Romania appears stuck in a bygone era. Many of the houses don't have running water. The traffickers have targeted this place, and the British woman who runs the local community centre says a girl goes missing every month.
The girls get involved through the Loverboy scheme. They're mostly young, vulnerable teenagers who fall in love with the pimps, who are normally older guys. The girls are very attracted by the Mercedes and the Audis that the pimps are driving around in.
Juana was trafficked to Germany for prostitution. Now, with her life back on track, she's come to the community centre to warn the local kids of the dangers.
I tell to girls to don't trust guys so easy.
Juana hopes she'll make the village's teenagers think twice. A village like Nicorest really struggles to offer its young the jobs and the opportunities that they might want in the 21st century. And the traffickers exploit that. They act, in effect, like real-life Pied Pipers. We went to a jail an hour north of Bucharest to meet a man who trafficked women and girls to Italy for 5 years. He claims he didn't use any force.
I don't know if it is exploitation, but when the girl agrees, I don't think that this is exploitation.
But how would you feel if it was your sister or your daughter being trafficked?
You really don't think that it's someone's daughter. You think just that you have to make money and that's it.
Would you do it again?
Yes.
You would?
Yes.
Why?
After all I've done, they have taken everything from me. I've got nothing. I have to start again from scratch. So I wouldn't be sorry to do it all again.
In Nicorest, the worry is another 3 girls might be gone by Christmas. Some may go willingly to escape their poverty, but the life that awaits them, no one could ever knowingly wish for it. Naomi Grimley, BBC News, Eastern Romania.
So let's have a brief look then at some of the day's other news stories. Japanese IT company Fujitsu has announced that it's getting rid of 1,800 jobs in the UK. The firm says it wants to streamline its operations and insisted the decision was not linked to Britain's vote to leave the European Union. A court has heard that a 15-year-old girl accused of murdering a mother and her daughter told police that she and her co-accused had made 2 previous attempts to kill them. Elizabeth Edwards and her daughter Katie were found dead in Spalding in April. The teenager denies murder but admits manslaughter. A 15-year-old boy has already pleaded guilty to murder. Southern Rail is to hold talks with the RMT union tomorrow to try to resolve a dispute about the role of conductors. Members of the RMT walked out this morning at the start of a 3-day strike. They oppose plans for drivers rather than guards to operate the train doors. A fatal stabbing at a school in Aberdeen was potentially avoidable if teachers had been told that a pupil was carrying weapons. That was one of the findings of an inquiry into the death of 16-year-old Bailey Gwynn at Cults Academy last October. His killer, a fellow pupil, was later jailed for 9 years after being found guilty of culpable homicide. Our correspondent Chris Buckler reports now.
In what should have been the sanctuary of his school, a tree has been dedicated to remember Bailey Gwynn. He was stabbed to death here by another pupil who carried a knife and knuckle dusters into Cults Academy.
I think it affected everybody in school, whether it was his close mates or whether it was someone who just maybe seen him around in the corridor.
Bailey was killed by a boy who can't be identified because of his age. But today's report says the stabbing happened during an unplanned, spontaneous conflict that could not have been predicted or averted on the day. However, it concludes that the stabbing was potentially predictable and avoidable if those who knew that Bailey's attacker carried weapons in school had reported that to staff.
My first conclusion.
What wasn't contained in the limited parts of the report made public today was that 2 years earlier there had been a warning.
The head teacher was alerted that he was carrying a weapon on a bus, and I've considered that, and I thought she acted swiftly and appropriately, but she found nothing.
I suppose the point is, though, it was a red flag potentially.
It was a red flag.
And that makes it important. So why is it not in the summary of this report?
Well, it has a recommendation from this report.
Among those recommendations are giving school staff in Scotland the same powers as senior teachers elsewhere in the UK to search pupils without their consent. And the report also calls for a dedicated strategy to tackle knife crime in schools. There was such a scheme in recent years, but Aberdeen's council chose not to take part in it.
The loss of any child is completely regrettable, and of course we will work as hard and tirelessly as we can to make sure that such a tragedy doesn't ever happen again.
That loss is felt most at Bailey Gwynn's school and home. There they've lost not the subject of a report, but their friend and their child. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Aberdeen.
The Duchess of Cambridge has made her first solo overseas trip. She's been in the Netherlands for a day of engagements, which included lunch with the King and Queen and discussions on mental health problems. She also took a trip to see some of the old masters at the Royal Art Gallery in The Hague. The singer Will Young has announced that he is leaving the BBC show Strictly Come Dancing for what he says are personal reasons. The former Pop Idol winner says that he'd been pleased to take part in what he called one of the most loved shows on British television. BBC said that it fully respected his decision. Well, let's catch up with some football news then. And England came under sustained pressure in their World Cup qualifier against Slovenia tonight. It took some outstanding saves from goalkeeper Joe Hart to keep them in the game. Scotland and Northern Ireland were also in action this evening. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks reports now from Ljubljana.
For so long now, England's displays have left them out of tune with their fans' desires. Yet still they come, ever hopeful of change.
Cheers. Come on, England.
Gareth Southgate provided it by dropping his captain here in Ljubljana. So, is it time to say goodbye to Wayne?
He's coming towards the end of his career now, potentially, so I think there's no point just forcing him in the side just because it's Wayne Rooney.
No, we've got to go forward now. It's a young team. Yeah. Dyer, Henderson.
Got to use the pace.
It's the future.
If this is what the future looks like, though, those fans might want a refund. There's little point in bold decisions if they backfire. Just 9 minutes in, the man preferred to Rooney played a blind back pass from the halfway line.
For Dyer, the back pass is a horror.
And left his defence in all sorts of trouble. Joe Hart was alive to the danger. The woodwork was England's saviour for the follow-up. As the game grew, so did Slovenia's confidence. England looked to be lacking something. Fortunately, Joe Hart wasn't. In the second half, he rode to England's rescue twice in a matter of seconds. The latter a fabulous two-handed effort.
Henderson with another careless back pass.
Remarkably, he was at it again. Hart easily England's man of the match. But perhaps he wasn't to be the only saviour. Positive substitutions helping England to look far better in the last 15 minutes. But in this most public of job interviews, coming away with a point was really more than England deserved.
Well, in the last minutes of the game, there was an unsavoury scuffle involving Jesse Lingard and some Slovenian players. It's not yet clear what that was about. It is clear, however, that were it not for the brilliance of Joe Hart, England would have been leaving here tonight having suffered their first defeat in qualifying for 7 years. Simply, they were lacking fluency, they looked sloppy in possession, they looked ponderous. And were it not for the fact that Slovenia don't have any better finishers, they definitely would have lost this game. Slovenia, just to mention, at 67th in the world rankings, alongside Burkina Faso. Gareth Southgate tonight has said, though, that he's taken over a mess and he's had to steady the ship. Understandably, he's heaped praise on Joe Hart. Now, elsewhere in Group F, the pressure has intensified on Gordon Strachan. Scotland losing 3-0 to Slovakia in Bratislava. It leaves Scotland down in 4th place now in the group, and they face England next at Wembley. That's the big clash, of course, in Group F. And in Germany, in Group C, Northern Ireland lost 2-0 to the world champions. Northern Ireland now sit 3rd in their group. And England, well, they will leave Slovenia here tonight, still top of Group F after 3 fixtures, but it was certainly not much to write home about. Hugh.
Natalie, thanks very much for the updates there on those matches. Natalie Perks in Ljubljana. Quick reminder, Newsnight's about to come up on BBC Two. Here's Kirsty.
Remember all that talk about the hundreds of millions we pour into the EU every week? Why doesn't the government want to talk about it now? We reveal the answer on Newsnight. Join me now on BBC Two, 11 o'clock in Scotland.
That's Newsnight with Kirsty here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.